Peru is a country of enormous contrasts. On one hand, it has the Amazon, one of the most biodiverse places on the planet. On the other, it has the Andes Mountains, with peaks that seem to touch the sky. And there is still room for a huge coastline, bathed by the Pacific Ocean, full of cities and deserts. It is a country of more than 30 million inhabitants, spread across landscapes that change completely in a few hours of travel. But despite all this diversity, a third of the entire population has decided to live in the same place. And guess where? In Lima, the capital. A city stuck in the middle of the coastal desert, which hardly ever sees rain, suffers from earthquakes, and still experiences glaring inequality and even a lack of drinking water in several neighborhoods. And then comes the question, why did they choose this city? Why did millions of people decide to suffer here when there are other regions of Peru that are much more pleasant to live in? Today, Bello Mundo takes you on a journey to understand the secrets and contradictions of Lima, the unlikely metropolis that has become home to a third of Peruvians. Believe me, you will be surprised when you learn about the reality of Lima, the worst-planned city in Latin America. The capital of Peru is located right on the Pacific coast. However, contrary to what many people imagine when they hear about a coastal city, it is not a postcard setting with blue sea, coconut trees, and fine sandy beaches. What exists there is a huge coastal desert, dry to the soul. Just to give you an idea, the average rainfall is so low that it is less than in much of the Middle East. In some years, there is practically no rain at all. And yet, there is a contradiction that confuses any visitor. The sky is covered for much of the year by a cold fog called garua. It feels like it is going to rain at any moment, but the rain never comes. The climate is gray, somewhat melancholic, humid without being wet. It's like living in a cloudy desert where the sun always seems to be hidden behind a curtain. As if this scenario weren't challenging enough, the region is located on top of a geological fault. In other words, earthquakes are part of everyday life. Historically, the city has been destroyed and rebuilt several times because of these tremors. In fact, much of the remaining ancient architecture is very low, precisely to try to reduce damage. And then comes the detail that draws the most attention. Despite this long list of natural challenges, the Peruvian capital has become a giant metropolis. Today, more than 10 million people live there. To compare, it's as if almost half the population of Chile were squeezed into a single city. And that's not all. This sea of people occupies a tiny strip of the map. The metropolitan area, including the capital and the neighboring port of Callao, occupies less than 1% of Peru's territory. In other words, a grain of sand on the map concentrates a third of the country's entire population. So we're talking about a place that lives on earthquake alert, suffers from water shortages, has no green areas, spends most of the year under a gray sky, surrounded by sand, and yet is always full. What explains so many people crowding into this unlikely spot? To understand how this unlikely place ended up becoming the heart of Peru, we need to go back in time. We are talking about the year 1535, when Spanish conquistador Francisco Pizarro decided to found the so-called City of Kings there. The choice may seem strange today, but for the Spanish, it made perfect sense. The Rimac River Valley had fertile soil, was close to the sea, and was still protected from the constant threat of pirates who roamed the coast. A few years later, this newly born city had already been chosen to be the capital of the most powerful viceroyalty in Spanish America. And that was no small feat. From there, the crown controlled not only Peruvian territory, but also extremely rich regions such as Upper Peru, where the Potosi silver mine was located. All the wealth that came out of the Andes first passed through the nearby port of Callao, then went to the capital, and from there was shipped to Europe. This transformed the city in a short time. Huge churches, convents, palaces, universities, and trading houses sprang up as if they had sprouted from the ground. Merchants from Europe, Asia, and even Africa arrived there to do business. It was a place of encounter and power, and this strength did not come only from trade. The city also became a religious, cultural, and even legal center, as it was home to the royal audience, which functioned as a colonial court. However, growth came with dangers. Strong earthquakes struck the region several times, destroying buildings and forcing reconstruction almost from scratch. The most striking of these was in the 18th century, when a tremor practically devastated the capital and the port of Callao. Even so, the city rose again and continued to be the most important center of the viceroyalty. This beginning gave it an advantage that no other city in the country had. While other regions remained more isolated or less developed, the capital had already accumulated centuries of political, economic, and cultural centrality. This historical weight meant that, even after independence, it was unthinkable to take away its title as capital. From its inception, it was shaped to be the center of everything, and that's where the story begins to gain new chapters, because the prominent position that seemed like a privilege also brought enormous responsibilities. Soon there would be cycles of unexpected wealth, traumatic wars, and waves of people in search of opportunities. The scenario that was born in colonial times was about to change radically. After independence in the early 19th century, the capital remained the political center, but it seemed to have lost its luster. The country faced economic crises, internal disputes, and even the commercial influence that had previously come from abroad had diminished. But suddenly, an unlikely source of wealth appeared that turned history upside down: guano. Believe it or not, the treasure that sustained Peru for decades was made up of seabird droppings. Yes, exactly that. On the Chincha Islands, near the city of Pisco, there were entire mountains covered with this material. Centuries of accumulation transformed the islands into a natural deposit of high-quality fertilizer. The product was so sought after by Europe and the United States that by the middle of the century, Peru had become one of the richest countries in South America. And as always, it was the capital that benefited the most. The money from guano financed grandiose projects, wide avenues, modern public buildings, railroads connecting the center to the port of Callao. It was as if the city had been given a second life. In just a few years, the landscape changed, and the capital began to boast buildings that rivaled those of many European cities. However, this bonanza did not last forever. At the end of the century, the country entered the War of the Pacific against Chile. The capital was occupied, looted, and part of the works from the guano period were destroyed. Once again, the city had to rise from the ashes, and it did. It rebuilt buildings, resumed trade, and moved forward, as it had done so many times before. The decisive turning point would come in the 20th century. While the interior remained rural and poor, the capital consolidated its position as the Great Promise. Industry, commerce, universities, hospitals, everything was concentrated there. It was natural that millions of Peruvians began to migrate in search of a better future. The numbers show this avalanche. In 1940, there were just over 600,000 inhabitants. 20 years later, there were almost 2 million. In 1980, it exceeded 5 million. It was as if every family in the Andes and the Amazon had decided to pack their bags at the same time. This growth, of course, was not accompanied by planning and, as expected, ended up leaving a trail of problems. And the dilemmas that began in the 20th century would become even more visible in the following decades. Fast forward to today, and what we see is a metropolis that has grown too much and too fast. There are more than 10 million residents squeezed into a tiny strip of coastline. The result is a mixture of opportunities and hardships that coexist side by side. The first point is inequality. In neighborhoods like Miraflores and San Isidro, life resembles that of any modern big city. Wide streets, well-maintained buildings, crowded cafes, and award-winning restaurants have made Peruvian cuisine a worldwide success. But just cross a few avenues, and the scene changes completely. The so-called pueblos jóvenes are scattered across the hillsides and outskirts. These are makeshift settlements that sprang up decades ago and continue to grow, with houses made of raw brick, wood, and zinc. Dirt roads, lack of sanitation, and poor access to basic services. These settlements are completely neglected by the government, and the poorly constructed buildings are exposed to all kinds of risks. It is as if there were two different worlds within the same city. This inequality also appears in the most essential form of all, water. While in the wealthier neighborhoods, each person consumes an average of 350 liters per day, in the poorest areas that number can drop to 30. And it is not just the quantity that changes. Many families do not have piped water and depend on water trucks. They pay dearly for a resource that should be guaranteed, and often receive water of dubious quality. Another specter that haunts everyday life is seismic risk. As we mentioned at the beginning of the video, the capital is located on top of a geological fault, and this is not an urban legend. In 1940, an 8-magnitude earthquake shook everything, left thousands homeless, and marked the collective memory. Experts say that a similar tremor could happen again at any time, and most of the current buildings, especially those on unplanned hillsides, simply would not withstand it. Living there means living with this constant threat, like a sword hanging over the city. And then there's the traffic, which has become synonymous with chaos. The population explosion has not been accompanied by an adequate transportation network. Today, there is a subway line and a few express bus lines. But it's not enough for a metropolis of this size. The result? Crowded cars, vans, and buses clog the streets every day. According to a study conducted by the navigation systems company TomTom, Lima has the second worst traffic in Latin America, second only to Bogota, Colombia. According to the study, commutes in Lima take 55% longer than they would under normal conditions. It is no exaggeration to say that many people lose up to 4 hours a day just to get to and from work. Half of a resident's life can be lost on a stationary bus. And this time obviously impacts the country's productivity and, above all, the quality of life of its inhabitants. As part of the celebration of Peru's 200 years of independence, the government announced plans to build the bicentennial city. This project, which will cost $3 billion, is designed to house approximately 115,000 inhabitants with adequate infrastructure and will help reduce overcrowding in Lima. We hope that the project will actually be completed and that Lima will be remembered only for having one of the best cuisines in the world, for its historical heritage, and for many other positive aspects. The air also suffers. With so many old vehicles on the road and little fleet renewal, pollution has taken over. The climate, already gray from the drizzle, is made even heavier by the smoke and smell of burning fuel. Breathing is almost always a challenge, and behind all this is the same issue. The city grew without planning. It advanced as far as it could, occupied riverbanks, climbed hills, and pushed the poorest into risk areas. There are entire neighborhoods on fragile slopes, subject to landslides and rockfalls. Others have sprung up on dry land that cracks in the heat and turns to mud when it rains. It is as if the expansion happened on the fly, and now improvisation is taking its toll. There are still other problems related to the lack of planning, such as social inequality, lack of access to public services for a large part of the population, and lack of security. These are issues common to virtually every large Latin American city. In the end, the capital has become a true reflection of Peru. It is where the best opportunities are, but also the greatest challenges. After this journey through history, contrasts, and dilemmas, the answer begins to take shape. The reason that led so many people to settle in this unlikely place has nothing to do with natural beauty or quality of life. Quite the contrary. What attracted and continues to attract millions of people are the opportunities. Since the time of Francisco Pizarro, the city has been the center of power. First, it was the center of politics and commerce during the colonial period. Then, in the Republic, it became the stage for economic cycles that marked an era. It was the capital of the viceroyalty, the point of departure for silver from Potosi, the heart of the guano trade in the Chincha Islands, and the headquarters of major banks and universities. Each of these phases reinforced the idea that if someone wanted to improve their life in Peru, that was where they should be. And that logic has not changed. Those seeking employment, education, healthcare, or simply a chance to start over end up targeting the capital. Of course, Peru has other important cities. Arequipa has tradition, Cusco breathes history, and Trujillo and Piura also have regional weight. But none of them has as many services, as much infrastructure, or as much visibility as the capital has accumulated over centuries. The result is a metropolis full of contradictions. On the one hand, there are modern neighborhoods, award-winning restaurants, an international airport, and a vibrant urban life. On the other, there are entire communities living without sanitation, buying expensive water from tanker trucks, and facing traffic that consumes precious hours every day. It is a portrait of extremes, luxury and precariousness sharing the same space. Even so, for millions of Peruvians, it makes sense to live there. Because despite the earthquakes, the eternal drizzle, the water shortages, and all the difficulties, that is where the greatest opportunities lie. It is where the market is, where the government is present, where you can take a chance on something different. Ultimately, centuries of centralization have transformed a humid and shaky desert into home to a third of the country's population. In short, the capital concentrates the best and worst of Peru. Those who live there are well aware of this fragile balance, a city that defies logic but remains the inevitable destination for those who dream of changing their lives. Did you already know this whole story about Lima? Were you surprised by any details? Leave your comments below. Thank you for joining us here, and see you on our next adventure through our Bello Mundo. Until next time.